Daniel first noticed something was wrong when Max, his large, loyal Labrador, started growling at the corner of Noah's nursery every single night. At first, he brushed it off. Maybe Max was just adjusting to the baby. But by the third night, the growling turned into a low, steady rumble, Max's hackles rising as he stood guard over the crib. Emily, his wife, dismissed it. "It's probably just a shadow freaking him out," she said, stroking Max's head. Dogs see things differently. But Daniel knew Max. This wasn't fear or confusion. It was warning. On the fifth night, he decided to test a theory. While Emily slept, he moved Noah's crib slightly, just enough so the corner Max growled at was now partially blocked. That night, Max still growled, but now he faced the door instead. Something was coming into the room. The realization made Daniel's skin crawl. He barely slept, keeping one hand on Max's fur, waiting. At 3:12 a.m., Max shot up, teeth bared. The baby monitor crackled with static. Daniel reached for his phone's flashlight and shined it toward the corner. Nothing. But the air in the room felt heavier. The next morning, Daniel installed a motion sensor camera in the nursery. He told Emily it was just for peace of mind. She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. That night, Daniel sat in bed, the live feed on his phone screen, waiting. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the nursery camera detected movement. Daniel's breath hitched as he stared at the screen. The crib rocked slightly, as if someone had touched it. Max was already growling, his massive body positioned protectively between the crib and the rest of the room. Then, the closet door creaked open. A shadow moved. Daniel bolted out of bed and into the nursery, but by the time he flicked on the light, there was nothing, just Max standing rigid, staring at the closet. The baby slept soundly. He checked the footage again. There, in the grainy darkness, was a figure standing just inside the closet, barely visible, as if it had materialized from the shadows. Daniel felt the bile rise in his throat. Emily finally took him seriously when she saw the footage the next morning. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, hand trembling over her mouth. "I don't know," Daniel admitted. But he did know one thing. He wasn't letting this continue. That night, he didn't just set up cameras. He sat in Noah's room himself, a baseball bat in hand, Max lying at his feet. Emily stayed in their room, too afraid to be near whatever had been lurking. At 3:12 a.m., the temperature in the nursery dropped. Daniel's breath became visible. Max snarled, ears flattened. His tail was stiff, his muscles tense. Then Daniel heard it. A whisper. Right next to his ear. "Give him back." He spun, swinging the bat wildly. Nothing. Max lunged toward the closet, barking furiously. The door rattled. Daniel reached for the handle, yanked it open, and Noah's old baby clothes fell to the floor. Empty. Except for a single footprint in the dust. It was smaller than his. Smaller than Emily's. A child's footprint. Daniel turned, sweat dripping down his back. Max kept growling at something unseen, something still there. The next morning, Daniel took the camera footage to a specialist, a friend from college who worked in forensic imaging. The friend watched in silence before slowly looking up. "There's something wrong with this," he said. "You can see the outline of someone in the closet, but," he zoomed in, "it doesn't reflect light properly. It's not solid." "Not solid," Daniel echoed. "Like it's not really here?" Daniel took the footage home and showed Emily. She turned pale. "We need to leave," she whispered. Daniel wasn't ready to run. Not yet. He needed to understand. He started researching the house's history, digging through old records. That's when he found it. A child had died in this house. A 3-year-old boy. In that very room. And the cause of death? Suffocation. Daniel's stomach twisted. That night, he stayed up, watching over Noah, Max at his side. At 3:12 a.m., the air chilled again. But this time, Daniel was ready. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Silence." "Why are you here?" Max whined, stepping back. Then, in the reflection of the window, Daniel saw something. A small figure. Standing behind him. A boy, barely 3, eyes hollow, face contorted in sorrow. "Give him back," the voice whispered again. Daniel spun, but there was nothing. Max whimpered, tail tucked. The next morning, Daniel and Emily packed up and left. They never came back. But the cameras? They kept recording. And every night at 3:12 a.m., the footage showed the same thing. A shadow standing in the nursery. Watching. Waiting. For someone to give him back. Daniel was exhausted. The sleepless nights, the paranoia, the overwhelming need to protect his son, it was consuming him. Every logical explanation had been exhausted. He checked the windows, the doors, the ventilation system. There was no hidden entry point, no drafts, nothing that could explain why Max, their loyal Labrador, was growling at the same empty corner every single night at precisely 2:47 a.m. Emily thought he was overreacting. Maybe he just smells something, she said dismissively. But Daniel knew better. The veterinarian had confirmed that Max was perfectly healthy, no neurological issues, no discomfort. Yet, every night, like clockwork, the dog would rise, his body tensed, eyes locked onto the same spot near Noah's crib. The growling had evolved into deep, guttural snarls, the kind that signaled something was terribly wrong. Daniel couldn't ignore it anymore. He bought a high-end night vision camera and set it up in the nursery, pointing directly at the corner Max was fixated on. That night, he sat in bed, staring at the live feed on his phone. 2:45 a.m. Nothing. 2:46 a.m. The screen remained clear. Then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., Max stirred. The temperature in the house dropped. Daniel felt it immediately, the kind of unnatural chill that settled in his bones. Max was already on his feet, ears pinned back, lips curled over his teeth. Then the screen flickered. Daniel's breath hitched. A figure. A silhouette barely visible in the grainy black and white footage. It was small. A child. Daniel shot up, nearly dropping his phone. He turned to Emily, shaking her awake. "Look at this." She squinted at the screen, still half asleep. "What?" Max let out a low, warning growl. And then, on the screen, the figure moved. It took a step forward. Emily gasped. "Daniel, what the hell is that?" Noah stirred in his crib. Daniel didn't hesitate. He ran. Through the dark hallway, past the dim glow of the nightlight, into the nursery, his heart hammering against his ribs. But the room was empty. Max stood guard by the crib, teeth bared, fur bristling. Daniel turned on the light, eyes darting wildly. The camera still streamed to his phone. He looked down at the screen. The figure was gone. Emily rushed in behind him, eyes wide with fear. "Check the footage." Daniel's hands trembled as he rewound the recording. At 2:47 a.m. A shadow. Emerging from the darkness of the corner. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "Daniel, we need to get out of here." But Daniel wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. The next day, he searched every record he could find about the house's history. That's when he found it. A newspaper article from decades ago. The previous owners had lost a child. A 3-year-old boy. Dead in that very room. Daniel's stomach twisted as he read the details. The mother, Margaret Sloan, had called 911 in a panic. Her son, Elijah, had stopped breathing. By the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. The cause of death? Suffocation. The circumstances were suspicious. The mother insisted Elijah had been fine when she put him to sleep. But the father, a strict, violent man, was arrested a year later for domestic abuse. Rumors swirled. Some believed Elijah had been smothered in his sleep. Others whispered about something far worse. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He looked at the grainy footage again, at the small, barely visible figure. "Give him back." The words from that night echoed in his mind. Emily refused to stay in the house another night. She took Noah and went to her parents' place, begging Daniel to come with her. But he wasn't leaving. Not yet. That night he sat in the nursery himself. Max sat beside him, eyes locked on the corner. Daniel had his phone in one hand, his baseball bat in the other. 2:46 a.m. The room was silent. 2:47 a.m. The temperature dropped. Max's growl rumbled low in his chest. And then, a whisper. Daniel's skin crawled. "Give him back." The voice was right next to his ear. Turned, the bat raised. Nothing. But then Max lunged. snarling, barking, snapping at the air. Daniel barely had time to react before the closet door slammed shut. The baby monitor crackled. Static. Then a sound that made Daniel's blood run cold. A child's sob. Max whined, backing away. Daniel forced himself forward, hands shaking, and ripped open the closet door. Empty. But on the dusty wooden floor, a single, small footprint. Daniel staggered back, his mind racing. This wasn't just a haunting. This was something else. Something unfinished. He needed to know the truth. And he needed to know before it was too late. The next morning, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the footage playing on his phone, his hands trembling. He had seen disturbing things before, but this was different. The night vision camera had caught something horrifying. At exactly 2:47 a.m., as Max's growling intensified, there was a shift in the room, not a sudden movement, not a figure appearing, but something much worse. The wall. It rippled. A distortion, subtle at first, like heat waves rising from the asphalt. Then, just as Max bared his teeth and let out a furious snarl, a shadow moved across Noah's crib. A shape, almost human, stretched thin and wrong, as if it were inside the wall itself. Daniel's stomach clenched. Max had sensed it before anyone else. The dog had known something was lurking, something unseen. Emily hadn't returned. She had called him from her parents' house that morning, her voice thick with fear. Daniel, leave the house. I don't care what you think you're doing, I don't care what you find, you need to leave. But Daniel wasn't ready. Not yet. He needed answers. The first thing he did was call a home inspector. When the man arrived, he was in his late 50s, a gruff, no-nonsense type with years of experience. His name was Frank, and he looked at Daniel like he was wasting his time. You got rats? Frank asked, setting his toolbox down. No. Mold? No. Frank exhaled sharply. Then what exactly am I looking for? Daniel hesitated. He couldn't just say there's something in my walls, and I think it's trying to take my son. Instead, he said, there's been movement. Sounds. Cold spots. I just want to be sure there's nothing behind the walls. Frank grunted and got to work. For the first hour, he found nothing. The house was structurally sound. No water damage. No loose beams. No electrical issues. But when he got to the nursery, Max immediately stiffened, his ears pulling back, a low growl building in his throat. Frank frowned. What's up with him? Daniel didn't answer. He was too focused on what the inspector was doing. Frank tapped along the wall near the crib. Solid. He moved a few feet over and tapped again. Solid. But then, Daniel's breath hitched. Frank knocked again. Hollow. Daniel's stomach twisted. Frank muttered something under his breath and reached for a small flashlight. There shouldn't be empty space here. Maybe an old pipe or a disconnected vent, but he trailed off, running his fingers along the baseboard. Then, with a sudden grunt, he pressed against the wall. The panel shifted. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears as Frank wedged a crowbar into the seam. With a sharp crack, the drywall gave way, revealing a narrow, dark opening. A crawl space. Daniel swallowed hard. He had lived in this house for years. He had never known about this. Frank clicked on his flashlight and shined it inside. Dust floated through the beam, thick and undisturbed. At first, there was nothing but old wooden beams and insulation. And then, Frank swore and stumbled back. Daniel caught a glimpse of it. A small, stained mattress. A single, tattered blanket. And scratch marks on the walls. Tiny fingernail scratches. Max started barking wildly, his body stiff with panic. Daniel stepped forward, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. He reached into the crawlspace, his fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. A locket. He pulled it out, the chain dangling loosely. The front was rusted, but when he pried it open, a faded picture lay inside. A woman. A boy. And a name scratched into the metal. Elijah. Daniel staggered back. Frank rubbed his jaw. Jesus Christ, he turned to Daniel. This ain't just some bad insulation, kid. Somebody lived in there. Not lived. Daniel barely heard him. His mind was racing. Elijah. The boy who had died in this house. The child no one could explain. Had he been locked in here? Forgotten? Had he suffocated inside the walls? The whispers. The cold spots. The give him back. It all made sense now. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his heart hammering. Frank packed up his tools. Listen, man. I don't know what's going on in this house, but if I were you... He pointed a finger at Daniel's chest. I'd get the hell out. Daniel didn't argue. That night he packed his bags. He grabbed Noah's things. He called Emily. We're leaving, he said. But as he stood in the nursery one last time, looking at the broken wall, the empty crawl space, the temperature dropped. And a voice, clear as day, whispered in his ear. You're too late. Daniel had barely slept. The crawlspace discovery had sent his mind into a spiral, but Emily's ultimatum was clear: either they left, or she and Noah would never set foot in the house again. He couldn't blame her. If he had any sense, he'd leave too. But something didn't sit right. A child had died in this house, hidden in the walls, and now Daniel had proof: Elijah's locket, the tiny scratch marks. But what if there was more? He needed someone else to take a look. The next morning, a new inspector arrived. George. He was different from Frank, taller, older, with deep lines carved into his face, like someone who had seen too much and lived to tell about it. When Daniel explained what had happened, George didn't react with skepticism or dismissiveness. He just nodded, pulled on his gloves, and got to work. From the moment he stepped into the nursery, Max went rigid, his growl low and steady. George tapped on the wall near the crib. Hollow. He moved a foot to the right and tapped again. And then, knock. From inside the wall. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Emily, standing behind him, clutched Noah tighter. George's hand froze. What the hell was that? Max's growling grew louder, his teeth bared, his entire body rigid with tension. Then, another knock. This time louder. Emily took a step back. Daniel, we need to go. But Daniel was already reaching for the crowbar, his grip tightening around the handle. George stopped him. Let me do it. His voice was steady, but his expression was grim. With one hard swing, he drove the crowbar into the drywall, splitting it open. Dust exploded into the air, and Max barked furiously. The stench hit them first. Rotten. Something foul and decayed. George yanked away another section of the wall, revealing a dark cavity behind it. He leaned in, shining his flashlight, and then he jumped back, cursing loudly. Daniel barely had time to register what he saw. Movement. Slithering. A sickening, writhing mass of twisting bodies. Snakes. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. Coiled deep in the cavity, their slick bodies writhing over one another. Some were small, but others, thick, black and vicious-looking, were nearly 5 feet long. Max barked wildly, snapping at the air, his instincts in full overdrive. Emily let out a strangled scream and bolted from the room, clutching Noah so tightly the baby began to wail. Daniel's entire body went cold. They had been living with this for years. Just inches from their baby's crib. George swore under his breath. Jesus Christ. No wonder your dog was freaking out. Daniel's stomach twisted. How the hell did this happen? George didn't answer right away. He grabbed a long metal rod from his bag and carefully pushed it into the cavity. The snakes hissed, some retreating deeper into the darkness, others raising their heads in warning. Then, George found the real problem. The insulation, he muttered. Collapsed years ago. The warm air from the vents? It attracted them. Daniel felt sick. He thought it was Elijah. He thought it was something paranormal, something malevolent lurking in the walls. But this was real. Flesh and blood. Venom. Emily was already shouting from the hallway. We're leaving. Right now. George nodded grimly. Yeah. You don't want to be here when these bastards get riled up. Some of them are venomous. Daniel forced himself to move, stumbling backward. He grabbed the locket from the dresser, his hands still shaking. As they backed out of the nursery, Max kept snarling, refusing to turn his back on the hole in the wall. And then, something moved again. Not the snakes. Deeper in the wall. A shadow. Daniel froze. The nursery was silent except for the sound of Noah's distant crying. But he felt it. Something watching. Something waiting. George exhaled and shook his head. I've seen bad infestations before, but this? He glanced at Daniel. You need to burn this house down. Daniel didn't answer. Because as he stepped into the hallway, one last glance at the nursery, he saw it. In the reflection of the glass picture frame. A small figure. Standing in the dark. Watching. Daniel didn't waste another second. He called pest control immediately, his voice shaking as he described the massive infestation slithering inside his walls. The operator on the other end didn't seem to grasp the urgency. Snakes in the walls? Sir, are you sure it's not just a few garter snakes? They're venomous, Daniel cut in, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. And they're nesting right next to my baby's crib? That got their attention. Within the hour, 2 specialists arrived. One a middle-aged man with sunburned skin, the other a younger, cocky-looking guy who reeked of cigarette smoke. Jesus Christ, the older one muttered as soon as they saw the gaping hole in the wall. The nest was still writhing inside, countless black bodies coiled together, pulsing like something alive. The younger exterminator whistled. That's a hell of a sight. Daniel didn't care about the theatrics. Get. Emily hadn't returned inside. She stayed in the car with Noah, refusing to let their son step foot in the house until every last snake was gone. Max, on the other hand, refused to leave the hallway, pacing anxiously, his body tense and ears pulled back. He had known all along. For weeks, months, even, Max had sensed something that Daniel had ignored. He had stood guard, growling at the unseen threat, warning them night after night. And Daniel, the idiot, had thought he was being paranoid. As the exterminators set to work, cutting away more of the drywall, Daniel crouched down and ran a hand over Max's thick fur. You knew, he murmured, guilt swelling in his chest. You were protecting him. Max let out a low, exhausted sigh and leaned into Daniel's touch. The older exterminator wiped sweat from his forehead, shaking his head. The good news? We can get them all out. The bad news? They've been nesting here for years. Daniel's stomach churned. There's more? The man nodded grimly. Oh yeah, this isn't just one nest. This is a colony. He gestured toward the wall. See how the insulation collapsed? That created the perfect space, warm, dark, close to a food source. The second one snake got in, the rest followed. They've been breeding in your walls. Daniel fought the urge to vomit. The exterminators worked for hours, methodically extracting snake after snake, stuffing them into thick, reinforced bags. Some of them hissed and thrashed violently, their sleek bodies twisting in the dim light. Rattlesnakes. Copperheads. One particularly massive serpent coiled tightly around a wooden beam, refusing to be removed. The younger exterminator struggled with it, cursing under his breath as it lashed out. Daniel took a step back, his skin crawling. These things had been inches from Noah. Just a thin layer of drywall had separated his infant son from dozens of venomous creatures slithering in the darkness. By the time the last snake was pulled out, it was well past midnight. Max finally relaxed, his body unwinding as if a massive weight had been lifted. For the first time in weeks, he didn't growl at the nursery. Daniel exhaled, feeling an exhaustion unlike anything he'd ever known. The exterminators packed up their gear, shaking their heads. I don't know how you didn't hear them, the older one muttered. With this many, you should have been hearing them move inside the walls. Daniel said nothing. Because he had heard something. Not hissing. Not rustling. Knocking. That same hollow sound, night after night, growing louder, more insistent. He forced the thought away. Emily finally stepped inside, still holding Noah close. The moment she saw the empty wall cavity, the torn insulation, the now quiet space where the infestation had been, she let out a shaky breath. Daniel saw the realization hit her, the full weight of what could have happened. She turned to Max, sinking to her knees and wrapping her arms around the big dog's neck. You saved him, she whispered, pressing her face into his fur. You saved our baby. Max wagged his tail, his eyes soft and trusting. Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. They spent the next several days repairing the damage. Daniel installed new insulation, reinforced the walls, and sealed off every possible entry point. He hired specialists to pest-proof the entire house, making sure nothing could get inside again. But even as he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. Not the snakes. Not anymore. Late at night, when the house was quiet, he'd catch glimpses of movement in the reflection of the glass. A small shadow. A boy standing just outside his vision. Waiting. The story spread like wildfire. Within days, the local news had picked it up, running headlines like, "Hero Dog Saves Baby from Hidden Snakes." Neighbors who had never spoken to Daniel and Emily before suddenly stopped by, eager to hear every chilling detail. Some just wanted the story, others brought gifts from Max, bags of premium dog food, chew toys, even a brand new bed. The vet clinic, where Daniel had taken Max just weeks earlier for a checkup, presented him with a medal for bravery. But none of it, the attention, the praise, changed what Daniel felt deep in his gut. Something was still wrong with the house. He hadn't told Emily. Not yet. She was happy now, relieved, believing the nightmare was over. And maybe it should have been over. The exterminators had cleared out the snakes. The house was secure. Max wasn't growling anymore. But Daniel knew better. The whispers hadn't stopped. The first time he heard them again was 2 nights after the last snake was removed. Emily had gone to bed early, exhausted from days of stress. Noah was asleep in his crib. The house was still. And then, a soft tap against the wall. Daniel sat up straight. Max's ears twitched. He lifted his head, sniffing the air, but he didn't growl. He didn't move toward the nursery. Daniel swallowed hard, staring at the wall. It was just his imagination. He forced himself to relax, forced himself to believe that it was all over. He turned off the light, rolled over, and shut his eyes. And then, "Give him back." Daniel's entire body went cold. The whisper was right next to his ear. He bolted upright, heart pounding, flipping the bedside lamp back on. But there was nothing. No shadows. No movement. Max, lying near the door, barely lifted his head. He seemed completely unbothered. Daniel rubbed his face, forcing himself to breathe. It was in his head. It had to be. But the next morning, something else happened. As he scrolled through his phone, he noticed a new comment on the news article about Max's bravery. It was from an anonymous account, and it simply said, "The dog didn't save your son. He saved you from what's still inside the walls." Daniel's blood turned to ice. He clicked on the user's profile. It was empty. No posts, no followers, no history. Just a blank, faceless account. His hands shook as he reread the message. He glanced at Max. The dog was chewing on a new bone, completely at ease. Everything was fine. But deep down, Daniel knew. It wasn't.